Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, and business. This week, Dennis McIlnay discusses his book, Juniata River of Sorrows.
Dennis McIlnay, author of Juniata River of Sorrows. Why is it a river of sorrows?
It's a river of sorrows because in the 1750s, when the Juniata Valley really was the known Pennsylvania frontier, in that 10-year period, about 1,000 colonists were killed, kidnapped, or tortured on the Juniata by the Indians.
Why?
Because of the encroachment of the Indian land by the colonists who had driven the Lenape Indians, the Delaware Indians we call them today, from their traditional homeland in the Delaware Valley westward, first to today's Sunbury on the Susquehanna River, today's Harrisburg on the Susquehanna, and not long after through the Juniata Valley and westward across Pennsylvania into today's Ohio in less than 70 years. This tribe of Indians is estimated to have numbered about 9,000 at the time and was driven all the way across today's Pennsylvania less than a century. Some of the Delaware Indians, one tribe, the Minzi, the most warlike of the three tribes of the Lenape, retaliated with a series of terrorist, we would call them today, raids on colonists in the Juniata Valley in the 1750s. This period's called the Indian Wars in Pennsylvania history.
Where are the Lenape now?
That's a good question. Extirpated, drifting, with the wind, as it were. There's a few, I've read that there are a few still Delaware Indians in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, Michigan. I've seen reference to them as well. That they are extirpated, as is another tribe, an ancient tribe in the Juniata Valley called the Uni-Uatahaga, a branch of the Iroquois.
For people who don't know, a couple basics about the Juniata. Where is it?
The main branch of the Juniata is in central Pennsylvania and extends from a village called Ardenheim near the town of Huntington, eastward, into the Susquehanna River at Clark's Ferry near Duncannon. The Juniata crosses thus Huntington, Mifflin, Juniata, and Perry counties.
How long is it?
It's 100 miles long, almost exactly from Ardenheim to the Susquehanna at Clark's Ferry. The Juniata watershed spans 12 counties, unlike the main branch itself, and square miles of 3,400 square miles, the watershed itself. It's a third the size of Maryland.
Now, what exactly is the point that the river starts? Can you point to it and say, this is where it starts?
You can. It's called the source point of the river. It's called the origin in geology, and it is at a place called the Point. There's a Pennsylvania Fish Commission access there called the Point Access, near this village of Ardenheim that I mentioned. The issue, however, about the source of the Juniata is contested today. I've had people ask me about the source point, the origin of the Juniata. Some people claim it begins on the Frankstown branch, one of the two major branches of the Juniata. Others claim the river begins on the Raystown branch, the other major branch. This issue, by the way, I uncovered in my research, was contested as early as the middle 1750s, when colonists near today's Huntington could not agree on the source point, like today, of the Juniata, and petitioned the Pennsylvania provincial government to send surveyors there and determine the source, the origin of the Juniata. Those colonial surveyors reported to the government and later to the colonists that the source point they determined to be at what we call the Point today in Ardenheim, and that's the basis of the beginning of the Juniata, its origin.
Do the two other rivers or streams that come together to form it?
Yes, there are 400 tributaries of the Juniata. The two main branches are the Frankstown branch and the Raystown branch. The Raystown branch many people are familiar with because they see it near Everett on Route 30 between Breezewood and Everett. The Raystown branch flows east from Bedford to Breezewood, near Breezewood, does a U-turn, flows west for about 10 miles, 5 or 10 miles, and then flows north. It forms when it's dammed, Raystown Dam. The water out of the dam joins the Frankstown branch near Huntington. The Frankstown branch comes from near Claysburg through Hollidaysburg, east through Williamsburg, and ultimately through Huntington, and joins the Raystown branch just a little southeast of Huntington, forming the main branch of the river.
Where does the river end?
It ends at Clark's Ferry on the Susquehanna, near the town of Duncannon. There's a big bridge over the Susquehanna River there. There's another bridge over the Juniata there called the Quarter Mile Bridge. A lot of people pass right by there in crossing the river at Clark's Ferry, the Susquehanna at Clark's Ferry.
How wide is it?
That depends on what part. The upper half from, say, Huntington to roughly Lewistown is narrower, a couple hundred yards wide. The lower half from Lewistown to Clark's Ferry is wider, flatter land, fewer mountains, less steep land, and perhaps a half mile wide at its widest point. Near Millerstown, I would say, it's maybe a half mile wide. It's not a wide river, it's a shallow river. It's a slow river, flows less than a mile an hour, typically in the summer. The Lenape Indians called it the River of Shallows long time ago.
Does it have any uses?
That's a good question, because the navigability of the Juniata is an issue. It's still an issue today. It was an issue in the 1700s when a miller from whose last name was Kreider from Huntington, on a bet, built what he called an ark, loaded it with grain and floated it down the Juniata, down the Susquehanna, through the Chesapeake Bay, and all the way to Baltimore, to prove that the Juniata was navigable and could be used for such traffic, for commercial traffic. The Pennsylvania legislature declared both the Susquehanna and the Juniata to be public waterways, and thus available for commerce, and thus endorsed the role of those rivers for commerce. The Juniata has never really been used much as a navigable waterway. It's shallow. It's probably too shallow. Some people, however, argue that if you can float a log down the river, it's navigable. One log is enough to do it. I've heard that argument recently.
Does it have rapids?
It does have rapids. There are 6 classes of rapids according to a scale called the International Scale. The Class 6 rapids are the most dangerous, life-threatening. Few people have ever survived a Class 6 rapids. Class 1 rapids are thus the easiest, so to speak. There are only Class 1 rapids on the Juniata. So the Class 1 rapids are quite easily handled by a canoer or a kayaker of moderate skill. It's the definition. You can easily avoid the rocks in Class 1 water. Some serious canoeists and kayakers would laugh at Class 1 water as it's not very dangerous, but truly on the Juniata there are sections, Class 1 water notwithstanding, where it's dangerous.
Have you been through them?
Yes,
In a boat?
I've been through them in a boat. I floated the entire 100-mile Juniata River 2 summers ago.
What kind of boat?
In a 14-foot aluminum John boat, a fishing boat, and floated the entire river pretty much by myself.
Did you paddle or use the motor?
I paddled. I intended, my plan was not to use a motor at all. I have an electric motor that I used in places. There are some stretches of the Juniata in the lower end near the village of Center, Muskrat Springs, Fish Commission access, where the water moves so slowly that it hardly moves at all. And literally, it could take you half a day to float a mile in that section. So in some sections, I use my electric motor, or if I decided to go back upstream while fishing, I'd use my electric motor.
Why'd you do that?
Why did I do the float?
Yeah.
I saw the Juniata when I was 13 years old for the first time. My grandfather took me fishing on the Juniata. I never saw anything like that river in my life, before or since. A river that weaves its way through weed beds of a weed called water willow. People have seen this water willow, these weed beds in the Juniata, when they drive along Route 22 near Millerstown, or as I said, in the Raystown branch near Everett, between Everett and Breezewood. Thousands of people see the true nature of the Juniata. It's a river that flows sideways, as it were. I never saw that. I saw rivers in the Allegheny, Monongahela, as sort of moving lakes. The Juniata was a real river, a moving stream, almost like a piece of ribbon candy that weaves its way through these weed beds, through the rapids, through the mountains, as the river itself does. I was fascinated by this river, believe it or not, at the age of 13, thought about it for 40 years, moved back to central Pennsylvania and decided a couple years ago to float the entire river and to write a book about the experience, as well as trace its history. Its earliest recorded history was my goal, particularly the 16 and 1700s.
Did you catch any fish that day with your grandfather?
I did catch some fish that day with my grandfather.
What kind of fish?
Smallmouth bass and another species that's native to the river called rock bass. They're called red eyes. They have big red eyes, obviously. They're called red eyes. They're called rockies. They're a branch of the smallmouth bass, member of the smallmouth bass family. That's what I caught.
Have you been a fisherman all along?
I have been a fisherman all along. Something that I've inherited, and I still fish. I like to fish. I fished the entire float on the Juniata. I fished pretty much constantly when I wasn't dictating into the microphone. I had a voice-activated microphone that I used to tape my observations. I document the Juniata mile by mile over its 100 miles in the book.
How long did the trip take?
It took 15 days.
Did you camp?
I pulled the boat out. I initially thought I would camp, but if people who've done the Juniata know that it is not the easiest thing to find places to camp. Much of the ground is private. In the upper half of the river is steeper, narrower, sided on both sides by cliffs. There isn't many places to camp, believe it or not. People choose some of the islands. One island in particular near Mifflintown is called Bell Island. It's some 3 miles long. But most of the islands are overgrown with weeds and flooded, filled with brambles, difficult to find places to camp. So my goal was to camp, but I quickly realized I was a little too old for that as well.
Was your goal to catch enough fish to keep yourself alive?
That was my plan too, but that fell by that went over the dam too, so that didn't happen. I instead divided the river into 9 legs and arranged for people to give me a ride. I pulled my boat out at night with my trailer, and I stayed in motels. Mostly I stayed near Mifflintown, which is pretty much the center of the river, and there's I think 6 Fish Commission accesses. There's 9 on the Juniata entire length. 6 are within 35 miles of Mifflintown, so the central place for headquarters for such a trip. A good central place is Mifflintown. That's where I stayed.
Were there things that you discovered along your trip that really stand out in your mind?
Yes, the documentary discoveries stand out in my mind. I took approximately 1,000 photographs of the Juniata, some 40 of which are in the book. The water, the river, the wildlife, the deer, the great blue herons, the egrets, the nature of the water, the flow of the water stands out. That is memorable. It's indelible, actually, when you move along the speed of a river for 15 days, flowing about a mile an hour, I suppose, for the length of it. That was particularly memorable. I mean, I had dreams about this river when I was a child and an adult, and I still dream about this river, having done it. The geology is interesting. There's a little bit of that in the book as well.
Is the water clean? Can you drink it?
It's actually very clean, and there is in the book a section on the results of water quality studies on the Juniata performed by the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, and I reported the results of these 6 studies and interviewed a couple people who did them for the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. They did studies at various places along the Juniata over about a 10-year period. The water quality is quite good everywhere on the Juniata, with one exception, on the main branch of the Juniata, with one exception near Lewistown. They measure the water quality, and they also measure a factor that they call, that the Susquehanna River Basin Commission calls the physical habitat in the water. The presence of logs and rocks, the presence of falls, a variety of water, slow-moving, fast-moving, which makes for better habitat for the fish. The Juniata is quite clear, quite clean, as a matter of fact, and according to the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, actually mitigates some of the pollution in the lower Susquehanna. So it's quite clean.
You have at the end of some of your chapters 2 little items with bullet points. One is fishing hot spots, and the other is boating trouble spots. First of all, is it something that fishermen don't do to give away the hot spots?
The hot spots is a word that fishermen do indeed use. It's subject to one's interpretation, arguable, contested between fishermen. I put them in as to where I thought might be the best place to fish in a span of the river, in a leg of the river, in typically a 5 or 6 mile area. Some places, every inch of the river is fishable, a hot spot. One side perhaps better than another, a hole, a pool, a falls, a particularly pretty place I would call a hot spot, and did call a hot spot as well. I've had readers say, you didn't name this hot spot, or you missed that hot spot, or did you withhold some hot spots for yourself, accusing me of secrecy. But typically I identified what I thought was a nice place to fish, nice places.
Do you have some favorite spot along the river that someone watching this program you would want to tell them, you've got to go see this?
An easy place to see the river and to see the beauty of the river is the Mifflintown access of the Pennsylvania Fish Commission, one of the 9 accesses that the Fish Commission built. It's about 2.5 miles upstream from the town of Mifflintown itself, off of Route 35. And it's an endless source of confusion for visitors because they assume the ramp, the Mifflintown access, the Mifflintown ramp is in the town of Mifflintown, which it is not. It is, of course, upstream. At that ramp, you can see how the river is framed by weed beds for about a 1/2 mile span. It's one of the most magnificent spots on the river, probably my favorite spot. The float from Mifflintown access to Mifflintown itself, some 3 miles. The river is divided by Bell Island. It's really 2 streams, not much of a river at all. If you didn't know it was the Juniata, you'd think it was a stream, almost a trout stream. That's how narrow it is around the island.
You mentioned egrets and
yes.
What was the other one?
Great blue herons.
Great blue herons. Did you see many of those along the river?
Yes, you see them throughout the length of the river in the summer.
For people who have not seen them, how big are they?
They're about 4 feet tall, 3.5 to 4 feet tall. The great blue herons are grayish color, bluish sometimes, but typically gray, very wary. Difficult to get near them. I have photographs of them. It's difficult to get close enough, even with a telephoto lens. They're very spooky, very wary. They fly. They see it coming, they fly.
How big is the wingspan?
Probably 4 feet, 5 feet, I would guess. I wrote about them using information from the Fish Commission website about these birds in the book as well. There's snowy egrets and great egrets. The great egret is about as tall. They're white. The egrets are white. The great blue heron is gray. The snowy egrets, the great egret is probably 4 feet tall, 3.5 to 4 feet tall, to about the same height as a great blue heron. The snowy egret's white too, but smaller, maybe 3 feet, 2.5 feet tall.
Are they uncommon?
They're not uncommon. You see them all the way along the Juniata, especially from Lewistown downstream, from about the middle down. You see them a lot around Millerstown, Newport, Port Royal, Mifflintown, Amity Hall. They're all along the river, especially for some reason the lower half of the river. I noted that.
Any eagles along the river?
There are eagles. I saw bald eagles many times. And other people report seeing them too. They're very wary as well. I did see one. I tried to photograph it, but I was late. I did see one swoop down, as they do, as I wrote, as in Yellowstone Park, and pick a fish out of the river, which was astounding. Indeed.
Where do you go if you want to see a bald eagle?
Pretty much anywhere along the river you could see them. I've seen their nests somewhat back off the river. They don't seem to nest right along the water. They're back off the river, maybe 25, 30 yards. I've seen big nests in back. They're pretty wary as well, easily spooked. I've seen them near Newton Hamilton in the upper stretches of the river. I've seen them near Ryde. I've seen them near Mount Union. These are spans in the upper spans of the river. I've seen them near Millerstown. I've seen them near Mifflintown. I've seen them year after year, too, by the way, in the same place. There seems to be one that a number of people have reported near the so-called blind camp near Mount Union in the upper half of the Juniata. That bird apparently has been there year after year.
Other animals you see living along the river on your trip?
Yes.
Deer, bears, raccoons?
Deer.
Like
I saw a lot of deer. You will see a lot of deer, especially early in the morning. Of course, late in the evening. I've seen mink. Mink. Mm-hmm. Raccoons. I've seen along the river. Muskrats. I didn't see otters, and I don't think the otters have been reintroduced to the main branch of the Juniata as we speak. They have been reintroduced. I believe 6 of them were stocked near Everett in the Raystown branch of the Juniata a year or 2 ago. And I believe the Fish Commission is planning to reintroduce them, if it hasn't already, to the main branch of the Juniata. I didn't see any otters, but I did see pretty much everything else that's along the river. I didn't see a bear either.
Was there much trapping that went on along the Juniata during colonial times? Was it a place where trappers went before settlers came?
Trappers, hunters, traders, yes, colonists, yes.
Well, who were the first humans to inhabit the area?
The earliest documented reference I found was a map. Actually, Captain John Smith's map dates to 1608. That makes reference, called the Map of Virginia, his Map of Virginia, makes reference to the Juniata. That is the earliest recorded reference that I found. Makes reference to a body of water called the Uniuata, named for the Uniuata Haga. 2 words. Uniuata means a standing stone. Haga means people. There's a chapter in the book called The People, the Standing Stone, the earliest recorded inhabitants of the Juniata Valley that I was able to find.
And there's literally a standing stone monument there now?
Yes, these Indians lived, their village, this very small tribe actually, lived at the junction of Stone Creek, sometimes called Standing Stone Creek, and the Frankstown branch of the Juniata in today's Huntington, town of Huntington. And they marked the entrance to their village with this monument that the trader John Harris, who later founded the town of Harrisburg, saw and recorded in his journal in 1753 as being 14 feet tall and 6 inches square. There's a replica of the standing stone, the original standing stone, that stands in Huntington in a small park in the town today, with a plaque. I have a picture of the standing stone in the book. The actual standing stone disappeared along with the Uniuata Haga. This replica was erected in 1896.
You have on page 24 of your book, I think it's 25 different versions of the word Juniata, which have shown up in different documents over the years?
Yes. The Juniata is a very famous place in colonial Pennsylvania. More famous than ever I realized, not being a trained and a professional historian. So in reading everything I could find in the minutes of the Provincial Council, the Pennsylvania Archives, and lots of other sources about the early days in Pennsylvania, I came across many references, hundreds of references to the Juniata by other names, some of which were close to the Juniata, such as the Juniata, for example, with E's instead of A's. Some are similar or less similar, let us say, to the Juniata. I found poems from the middle 1800s, a song from the middle 1800s also about the Juniata, as well as probably 30 words, I believe 25 I report in the book, versions of the word Juniata. Some writers, officers of the Pennsylvania provincial government, some surveyors for the Pennsylvania provincial government who worked in the Juniata Valley wrote as many as 6 letters, 6 reports I found in a given day, each one of which had a different spelling for the word Juniata.
Who were the first Europeans to settle there in the area?
This is a large group of people from a number of countries in Europe, typically called the English, but they were not only from England, from Scandinavia, the German states, you name it in Europe. These people entered the country typically through Philadelphia. The English, the merchant class, tended to stay in Philadelphia in the early 1700s. This occurred, 1720s. The Germans, the Pennsylvania Dutch, we call them, being farmers, left Philadelphia, went west, found great land near Lancaster, and settled there. The Scotch-Irish, the third major group of the European colonists, were feisty, could not get along with the English in Philadelphia, were not city folks to begin with, could not get along with the land-hungry, as it were, Pennsylvania Dutch, the Germans, and moved farther westward, crossing the Susquehanna and entering the Juniata Valley. It is the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians who settle first in the Juniata Valley in between 1725 and 1750. Thousands of such Scotch-Irish settled the Juniata Valley. There are areas in the Juniata Valley near Hollidaysburg, for example, where I live. There's an area called Scotch Valley, named, of course, for the many Scotch-Irish people who settled there in the early 1700s.
You say in here, in the spring of 1749, more than 30 colonists and their families crossed the endless hills and settled illegally on Indian land in the Juniata Valley. The Lenni Lenape complained to the Iroquois about these trespassers.
Yes.
You say they illegally settled. Whose law were they breaking to settle there?
They were breaking a treaty that the Pennsylvania provincial government executed in the early 1700s with the Iroquois, which controlled all the land in New York, what is today New York, and pretty much Pennsylvania as well as a treaty with the Lenni Lenape. This treaty set aside land west of the Blue Mountains today as being that of the Indians and not available for colonization. Settlers were not permitted there. The Indians called the Blue Mountains, our Blue Mountains, the Endless Hills. Land to the east of the Blue Mountains, land essentially to the east of the Susquehanna River today, was available for colonization, and the settlers were permitted there. The problem began when these feisty, stubborn, adventurous, in some cases criminal, outlaws, the Scotch-Irish, refused to abide by the terms of this treaty, crossed the Susquehanna River illegally, and settled pretty much wherever they wanted to settle. In 1749, some 30 families did cross the Susquehanna River, entered the Juniata Valley south of today's Huntington. The Indians complained to the Pennsylvania provincial government about these trespassers. The government formed a raiding party of 6 justices of the peace, a couple of other sheriffs, located these families, some of whom had built cabins in today's Huntington and Fulton County. Approached these settlers, asked them to leave, told them they were violating this agreement, they were trespassing. The settlers, the Scotch-Irish, would not leave. The sheriffs arrested these people and burned their cabins so that they would not return. That did not stop, however, the Scotch-Irish from coming more from the east. It didn't stop the ones whose cabins were burned from staying either, by the way. So many cabins were burned. of these trespassing Scotch-Irish in 1749 in an area on the Huntington-Fulton County line that there's a village there today called Burnt Cabins.
Can I ask you a little bit about yourself?
Sure.
You are Dr. McIlnay?
I am.
Doctor of what? I'm
a professor. I'm a management professor at St. Francis University in Loretto, near Altoona. I have a joint appointment. I teach undergraduates in the business department, principles of management, strategic management, organizational behavior. And I also teach in our graduate programs, in our MBA, Master of Business Administration program.
How big a school is St. Francis?
It's a school of about 4,000, growing, especially in the graduate area. Our Master of Business Administration has classes in Loretto, the main campus, in State College, as a matter of fact, and in Johnstown. We have a Master of Education, Master of Industrial Relations, Master of Medical Science, Master of Occupational Therapy. Our graduate programs have grown sizably over the last 10 years. The undergraduate's pretty stable at about 3,000 enrollment.
How long have you been there?
This is my 17th year at St. Francis. Before that, I was at Seton Hall University. I was the Chief Development Officer for Seton Hall. I used to do fundraising work. St. Francis is the 5th college or university that I've worked for. I was in development work.
Did you teach at the other schools?
I did not. I did not. I always wanted to be a professor.
How'd you get a job as a professor after years of working for universities and not teaching?
I applied at St. Francis when I came back to this area. I taught a little bit at the Altoona School of Commerce on the side to get some experience. It's now the South Hills Business School, School of Business. There was an opening at St. Francis in the business department, and I applied, and I was hired.
Where did you grow up that you were living when you visited your grandfather at age 13?
I grew up in Latrobe, near Pittsburgh, and my father's family was originally from Bedford, Everett, Yellow Creek, little villages on the Raystown branch of the Juniata. They lived there. I never did. I lived in Latrobe. Went to school at St. Vincent Prep School, which is now closed, St. Vincent College, of course, still there. And was taken to the Raystown branch of the Juniata by my grandfather on a fishing trip.
What number book is this for you?
This is my 3rd book. I used to write about philanthropy when I was a development officer, and early in my career as a professor I wrote about philanthropy, foundation philanthropy particularly. I wrote about 2 books. I wrote 2 books about foundation philanthropy before this one. They were published by divisions of Simon & Schuster.
Had you ever tried to write history before?
Never. I did not.
What do you think of it?
I am not. I am humbled. Some of my friends are historians. I had some historians look at my work. I had some historians help me with my plan for the book. I've had historians, review the book as well. Real historians, unlike me.
Well, one of the things I learned from your book about history is William Penn. First of all, that Alfred Lord Tennyson called him the fixed light of a dark and graceless age. And second, you always hear about the king gave William Penn land to settle a debt, but I've never heard an explanation about how can the king be in debt to a commoner? Mm-hmm. And it said Sir William Penn, a vice admiral in the British Navy, had filed a claim for unpaid salary against the government for £16,000, approximately $23,000 today. So Sir William Penn did work for the king and didn't get paid for it, and he basically sued the king.
William Penn's father was an admiral, I believe his rank was, in the British Navy. Worked without pay to the tune of about, as you mentioned, $23,000. I believe at the time 16,000 pounds. Was not paid for his work. Filed a claim with the Crown for this 16,000 pounds. The Crown was unable to pay him in cash. He died. William Penn himself inherited this claim and his father as part of his father's estate. Tried to settle the claim with the king. The king offered land in the New World in lieu of the 16,000 pounds owed to his father, and William Penn took it. There's the original charter awarding Penn that land. I have excerpts of in the book. It's interesting to read.
Does it define how far west Pennsylvania goes?
It does. It does define. It does make such a definition, and it's pretty much consistent with our own boundaries today, as I understand it. I believe the northern and southern boundaries of the land were clearly defined, more clearly defined, if I'm not mistaken, back then, as opposed to the western boundary.
Now, according to your book, William Penn's sons were not chips off the old block, or the apple fell far from the tree. What approach did they take to governing the state?
This surprised me, thinking perhaps they would be much like he was, a visionary, a humanitarian, a real amazing figure. Hence Tennyson's attribution to Penn. His sons Richard, John, and Thomas were pretty much absentee landlords, they've been called. They were interested mainly in the land that they inherited from William Penn's estate after he passed away, of course. They were interested in selling the land, renting the land, attempting to control the Pennsylvania provincial government, attempting to control the Pennsylvania legislature at the time, the Pennsylvania Provincial Council it was called, wheelers and dealers, real estate developers, we might call them today, venture capitalists, we might call them today, self-centered, undoubtedly, in some cases crooked. The record speaks for itself with respect to this act called the so-called walking purchase. Among other ventures that his sons were engaged in, some illegal, many shady.
How did they get along with the Indians?
That's a good question, and I didn't investigate that too much. I investigated their transactions with respect to William Penn's land. I think their treatment of the Indians was negative. They abused the Indians in their ventures, in their agreements. They took advantage of the Indians in the sale of land, wherever they could. They essentially stole all the land in the so-called walking purchase, this famous rip-off, we would call it today, from the Indians.
Now, that's not quite in the Juniata Valley, but could you
no,
give a little
isn't.
thumbnail description of it?
No, it isn't. It's in eastern Pennsylvania. It's a triangular area of thousands of acres in eastern Pennsylvania. And the Penn brothers, among others, a couple of their cohorts, were in charge of the provincial land office. Cooked up this scheme for as far as a man could walk, that was the term, in a day and a half. The Indians, this land would be available. The Indians thought that would only be a short distance. It ended up being an enormous distance because Penn's sons, plus a few of their cohorts, hired 3 athletes. Their names are in the book. 3 tall men with great strides, a couple of athletic types. They cleared a path for these people to walk, these 3. They essentially cheated. The men were supposed to walk. Instead, they ran. The Indians came out to witness parts of this so-called walk, warned the walkers that they weren't walking, they were running. The Penn brothers cheated their way into this humongous piece of land. So the relationship with the Indians was one of taking advantage of the Indians and their land.
When did the nastiness with the Indians start? When did the raids start?
About the year 1750, the so-called Indian Wars, the Pennsylvania Indian Wars. The Minzi, one of the 3 tribes of the Lenape, what we call today the Delaware Indians, essentially said enough is enough. The other 2 tribes moved relatively quietly, pushed across Pennsylvania into what is today Ohio in less than 70 years. The Minzi stayed and fought and drew the line at the Blue Mountains, the endless hills. People who crossed that line in the view of the Minzi were trespassing, in the view of the treaty were trespassing. The Minzi decided to retaliate, led by a couple of Indians, one whose name was Shingas, Shingas, and another one whose name was Tewea, Tewea. who went by the moniker Captain Jacobs, was given that name by the colonists because he looked like a colonist, a fellow colonist by that nickname. The word captain was an honorary title, not necessarily a military one for a colonist, a citizen at that time. These Minzi, led by these two Indians, established villages on the Juniata all the way as far west as today's Katanning. And from there launched a series of raids in the Juniata Valley over a 10-year period in which 1,000 colonists were killed, captured, tortured, many instances that I uncover of these murders by these Indians. Some estimates have the number of colonists killed or captured during that 10-year period as high as 3,000. I went with the number 1,000, which I saw more often. No one knows for sure. There are tales of these murders that are documented, kidnappings, tortures as well, eyewitness accounts.
Were the Indians in league with the French at all at the time?
Yes, they were indeed. The French and the English were vying for what is today western Pennsylvania. The French having established a foothold in northern Pennsylvania, northwest Pennsylvania, Erie, had come down the Allegheny River, cut a path from Erie to the Allegheny, the headwaters of the Allegheny, established a fort in today's Pittsburgh, Fort Duquesne, were vying to control that part of Pennsylvania, today's western Pennsylvania, thinking that if the French were thinking that if they could control that part of today's Pennsylvania, they would stop the English movement, settlement, pretty much at central Pennsylvania and freeze the English from settling any farther west in Pennsylvania and thus freeze them pretty much in central Pennsylvania, the Juniata Valley. The English saw the need to defeat the French and thus control and begin to settle more westerly and throughout today's Pennsylvania and ultimately into Ohio. So that territory is very highly contested. The French and the English both tried to secure the friendship, the trust, the support of the Indians in that part of the state against each other. So some of the Indians sided with the French. Some of the Indians, such as the Minzi of the tribe of the Lenape, already had a grudge against the English colonists for driving them across Pennsylvania from their homeland, ancient homeland in the Delaware Valley. They were ready to side against the English, and some of those people joined the French in these Indian raids, by the way, on a fort called Fort Granville near today's Lewistown. Other Indians sided with the English and threw their lot in with the British colonists and the British government.
Who are Marie Leroy and Barbara Leininger?
My two favorite people from the Pennsylvania colonial period. Marie Leroy and Barbara Leininger were two 12-year-old girls. They were Swiss, and their families came here to provincial Pennsylvania in the middle 1700s, settled on Penn's Creek, a tributary of the Susquehanna, near the Juniata Valley, near today's Richland, town of Richfield in Juniata County. I believe it's northern Juniata County. These two 12-year-old girls witnessed a band of Indians during the Indian Wars, this terrorist raid period in the provincial government, witnessed a band of Indians in October kill their parents and their siblings, all but a few of their siblings, and take these two 12-year-old girls prisoner. These two 12-year-old girls were taken first to Clearfield, what we today call Clearfield. The Indians called it the Clear Fields, by the way. Later to Katanning, later to today's Pittsburgh, ultimately to northwest Pennsylvania, Beaver Falls, Shenango, Venango, those are all Indian terms. And ultimately, in a 3-year period, they were taken as far west as today's Ohio by the Indians, kidnapped by the Indians, made to work for the Indians. These two 12-year-old girls escaped from the Indians in the middle of winter in February after 3 years of captivity and found their way back from today's Ohio all the way to today's Carlisle, where they were from. And when they returned, they wrote the story of their captivity and their escape from the Indians and their return home through Ligonier, through Fort Ligonier, through Carlisle, and ultimately all the way back to the area near Gettysburg, near today's Gettysburg, near their homes. Their story is called The Narrative of Marie Leroy and Barbara Leininger, and it's a rare document from the Pennsylvania colonial period. It was translated from the German in 1896, I believe, by a minister from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, whose name was Edmund de Schweinitz. So it was originally written, I guess, in German, undoubtedly in German, and translated by this reverend. In Marie Leroy and Barbara Leininger's narrative, there is a sentence which moves me to this day. They pretended to be sick in Ohio. The Indians separated these two girls, put them in another tent so they would not infect the other Indians in the tribe, in the village. In pretending to be sick, the Indians left them alone. These two girls sneaked out of the village with two other male prisoners, boys as well, teenage boys, and they crawled through the snow through this village past the huts of the Indians. They didn't use teepees. They built huts covered with bark. In the middle of the snow up to their knees, they reported past 16 dogs that the Indians owned in the village. And the girls wrote in their narrative, quote, "In the merciful providence of God, not a single one of these dogs barked." And when I read that for the first time in their narrative, I read it at home in the evening, and I put that down, and I thought, that is just astounding. And so they are my two favorite characters from the Pennsylvania frontier.
Do you know what happened to them in their lives after they went back to Carlisle?
I don't. There's work on Barbara Leininger. Many freed captives or escaped, freed by the terms of treaties with the Indians, or captives who escaped, sought to be reunited with their families. And in some cases, they were reunited. These attempts at reunification came at places like Carlisle. And the families would come, in this case 3, 4, 5 years later, after the sons and daughters had been kidnapped. The Indians preferred to kidnap children. They could adapt to the Indian ways better than adults, incidentally, and try to locate their children who had changed physically, having grown by 3 or 4 years, were unable to do so. There is a story, I don't know if it's true, and I didn't investigate this very thoroughly. Barbara Leininger's mother tried to identify her at one of these reunion sites with a number of children around and a number of families circulating, all trying to find each other, and could not find her, could not identify her, and began to sing a song, a religious song, a gospel song at the time, a prayer song that she had sung to this child when Barbara Leininger was younger, as a younger child, and Barbara apparently, according to the story, recognized the song and the voice, and they were reunited. There is a series of paintings and lithographs that depict that incident, by the way, that I have seen.
Who's Jack Armstrong?
Jack Armstrong was a trader who worked along the Juniata Valley, typically near today's Mount Union, Newton Hamilton, along the Allegheny Path, which was a footpath that ran from the Susquehanna pretty much right along the Juniata River all the way to Katanning, originally an Indian path called the Katanning Path. Katanning's an Indian word. Later called the Frankstown Path, sometimes referred to as the Frankstown Path East, Frankstown Path West. Jack Armstrong, a tough character, had a brother by the name of Alexander Armstrong. Armstrong settled a debt with an Indian whose name was Moosameelan, who lived in today's Sunbury, what the Indians called Shamokin, by taking Moosameelan's horse in place in lieu of this debt. The debt is unclear in the record. The horse happened to have been this Indian Moosameelan's wife's horse. And she, according to the record, was not happy with the disappearance of her horse, the fact her husband gave it away to settle this debt. And so she pestered her husband to get this horse back. Armstrong went west along the Juniata with the horse. The Indian took this Moosomeelan Indian took 2 young Indians with him with the intention, the younger Indians did not notice, the intention was to kill Armstrong and his 2 manservants, they were called, 2 employees, fellow traders, and get that horse back. Jack Armstrong was murdered by this Indian, as well as his 2 servants, his 2 employees, near Mount Union, between the towns of Mount Union and Mapleton, along Route 22 in Huntington County, in a stretch of the river, a 3-mile stretch, one of the most magnificent spans, by the way, of the river. It's called Jack's Narrows, and it is named for Jack Armstrong, this trader. Some people say it's named for another fellow, an anecdotal character called Captain Jack.
I want to ask about him too.
Yeah, that's another story. This Jack Armstrong's brother, Alexander, sought to have the provincial government investigate this murder. He would not accept the answer no. The provincial government at the time said, what can we do? They're Indians. They don't understand our laws. We can't prosecute them. They don't speak English. So essentially the provincial government threw up its hands when its settlers were killed, or made some form of restitution with the leaders of the Indians. Alexander Armstrong, Jack Armstrong's brother, would not go for this. He would not buy this. And he insisted on a search party, formed one, went to Shamokin, today's Sunbury, got the Indians to back his search party, and they went to the Juniata Valley, along the Juniata River where this Jack Armstrong murder occurred, located the bodies of these 3 people, got evidence that the Indians had killed, this Indian Moosomeelan had killed these 3 white traders from the 2 younger Indians who had accompanied this Moosomeelan on this killing spree. The 2 younger Indians were not directly involved in the murder. Armstrong insisted to the provincial government that these Indians be tried, that this Indian be tried according to white man's laws, and the provincial government agreed for the first time and tried this Indian Moosomeelan, the first time that Indians were tried for capital crime in Pennsylvania. It's the first recorded instance. Found him guilty and hung him. And this incident, the murder of Jack Armstrong, thus as a result of his brother, the determination of his brother Alexander, changed Pennsylvania law on capital crimes committed by Indians. That's one of the significances of the Jack Armstrong incident.
And who was Captain Jack?
Captain Jack is by far the most famous personage in the Juniata Valley during the colonial period. There are a number of stories about Captain Jack that I uncovered from other people's research as well as my own. He was said to have lived near Mount Union, near the town of Mapleton, in the same area called Jack's Narrows, hence the confusion. His family, it is said, he came home one day after a fishing trip on the river. His family, his wife and 3 children were murdered. In one account, it's 3 children, one account, it's 2 children, and yet another account, he has 4 children. There's a number of stories of this fellow. He became enraged, entered the woods by himself, lived and declared war, as it were, one-man war on these Indians, terrorizing Indians up and down the Juniata Valley for some long time. I located every reference I could find about this person, Captain Jack, many of which mention historical events in which he is said to have participated, such as Braddock's march to attempt to take Fort Duquesne from the French. I then traced the actual historic record of each of these events, and I found no instance, I'm sorry to say, that this fellow was a real person. In the diaries of traders, the journals of missionaries, the orderly books of soldiers, the official military record, the surveys of provincial surveyors, orders of Pennsylvania political figures, other kinds of journals. The actual historical record from that period has absolutely no reference to this man. This, however, my historian friends helped me with, does not mean that he did not exist. Many people, such as a lawless kind of a ranger, as a Captain Jack might not want themselves in the historic record, might have avoided such detection in writing, although it's highly unlikely in any case. So I entertain the romantic notion that this person may have existed, even though the historic record I report in the book has absolutely no evidence that he actually existed. The students at Mount Union High School for years had the nickname the Captain Jacks. And people to this day, I get the Captain Jack question perhaps more than any other question when I do signings and appearances and so forth. People in the Juniata Valley, especially near Mount Union, Mapleton, even Huntington, Altoona, they are firm believers in the existence of this heroic figure, Captain Jack. He's actually mentioned in probably 90 works of history from the colonial period. And the historians who wrote about him apparently never checked whether he was alive. A historian by the name of Shirley Wagner in Huntington, who I have never met, but I'm a fan of hers, wrote an article for a Pennsylvania Journal of History. I think it was Pennsylvania History Journal, about this Captain Jack some years ago. And her research encouraged me to investigate him further.
You mentioned, we're just about out of time, you mentioned Fort Granville.
Yes.
And a couple other areas along Juniata. If you travel it, is there any place where you can see any evidence of any settlements or forts?
About all you can see is a sign of Fort Granville. There is a Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission marker, one of the blue and yellow markers, near the town of Huntington, just west of Huntington on Route 22, near the Pennsylvania Fire Academy. Behind the Pennsylvania Fire Academy was the apparent location of Fort Granville, built on the bank of the Juniata, in a ravine that the builders of the fort, a man by the name of George Croghan at the time, commissioned by the government to find a location to build a fort, thought would be the perfect place for a fort and a perfect overview of the area, and would be able to defend from any Indian attacks. It was a disastrous place.
We don't have time to tell the story of it, so whoever is interested in the story of Fort Granville will have to read your book. You said this is your first crack at history. You think you'll do it again?
I think I may. I think I may do it again. I'm thinking of a few things, down the road. I think I may. So time will tell.
Think you'll take the canoe trip again?
I'd like to do that again. It's hard. It seems romantic and paddling and drifting along, but it's hard. It's hot. The river is so shallow. You get stuck a lot, like every 10 feet. On the rocks, you got to jump out. You're wet to the waist all day long. You're sun whipped, they say, by the end of the day. It's a tough river to float in the middle of the summer when it's low.
We're out of time. This is the cover of the book we've been talking about, Juniata River of Sorrows. Dennis McIlnay, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.